Welcome back to One Brain Ops chess content. So today we're going to be looking at a game that comes from a tournament that I've mentioned before. So if you watched my Fire Emblem Radiant Dawn walkthrough, which I know nobody did, you might remember when I said this. Yeah, the reason I kind of took a break from recording here is actually I was preparing to play in a chess tournament, and so I just wanted to take a little bit of time to do that, and it ended up going really well for me, actually. Yeah, I actually hit a rating milestone with my result in this tournament. So I made it over 1700, which is kind of a big deal for me. I've been stuck at the kind of a plateau for a very long time. I first got above 1600 back in January of 2016. So yeah, I was stuck on kind of a rating plateau for quite some time, for almost 9 years. Something I've been working on for a long time, and it's good to feel like I'm finally making some progress in my chess. So yeah, today I'm going to look at one of the games from that tournament, a game that I won. And the reason that this game kind of stands out to me is that it was one of the better played games that I've had overall. I kept finding good moves. I got a small advantage early, and then I just kind of pressed it. So we're gonna look at the game. Let's go ahead and dive into it. And the other thing here is that I actually thought, until I went back and reviewed this game today, I thought that I had actually managed to hold on to the advantage for the entire game. Turns out I actually did slip up and allow a draw in the endgame that my opponent didn't find, so we'll get to that. But let's go into the game. So I had white in this game. So d4, knight f6, bishop f4, g6. So bishop f4 is the London system, of course. g6 is sort of playing a more King's Indian setup here. So rather than playing d5 and putting a pawn in the center right away, black is holding off on doing anything in the center right away. And the line that I have here, I actually get out of the basic London setup. So the main setup here would be to just continue with e3 and just play a normal London. I have a sort of sideline that I like to go down, which is knight c3. So technically this is the Jobava London now, by transposition, but we're not going to stay in the Jobava London. We will if black plays d5. So if black plays d5 right now, then I'm kind of forced to play a Jobava London, and I have a line here. But after bishop g7, I'm able to play e4 instead. And now we're not in a London system anymore. This is actually a transposition now into, well, at least after d6, it's a transposition into a Perk defense, alright? It's actually pronounced Peertz, but I've always said Perk because I'm American and we can't pronounce things right. So, I'm going to back up real quick and just kind of explain how this opening normally works. So, the Perk normally comes out of e4, and I actually learned this back when I was playing e4 regularly. So normally, e4, d6, d4, knight f6. The purpose of playing d6 for black is to make it so that white can't easily play e5 and chase this knight away. And then white can continue knight c3, g6, preparing to fianchetto the bishop. Then bishop e3, rather than f4, but you could play bishop f4. Bishop g7. Typically the move here is f3 to prevent the knight from coming out to g4 and harassing the bishop. So f3, castles, queen d2. And the way that you often see this go is, of course, white now is preparing to castle queenside. And then white is going to attack on the king's side. So ideas like bishop h6 to trade off the dark squared bishops, g4, h4, and then eventually h5. And depending on how black plays this defensively, there's a number of different setups you can get into. It is very double-edged. Black usually will play something along the lines of either c6 or a6, and then b5, b4 to try to basically do the same thing on the other side of the board, with white's king being over here. So it is a very double-edged position, and it's one of my favorite lines to get into. So the way that I get into it, though, is I use it as an anti-King's Indian weapon out of the London. So when I see my opponent playing like this, if they don't play d5 here and stop me from playing e4, I'm able to get this perk set up now. And then after d6 to prevent e5, I go ahead with queen d2, castles, and you see it's basically the same idea. The only difference is that the bishop moved to f4 instead of e3, but that's going to become a moot point because the bishop is going to try to go to h6 and trade itself off right now. So bishop h6. My opponent played knight c6, and I went ahead and castled queenside. You can just go ahead and take this right away. The idea of bishop h6 is just that we're going to trade the bishop off. This is one of black's best pieces in this sort of setup. If you are familiar at all with the Sicilian Dragon, you know kind of this idea, and particularly the Yugoslav attack for white. White actually plays it very similarly to how this line of the perk goes. This, by the way, is known as the 150 attack, this line. But a lot of similar ideas, one of which being get the bishop out here and trade it off right away. So, yeah, white absolutely can just capture immediately. I castled queenside. There's really not much of a difference there. I was basically just giving my opponent one more chance to let my queen come in here by capturing himself. And instead of doing that, my opponent made a different sort of mistake here. So instead of capturing the bishop, he played knight g4, which it does force me to do something with this bishop here because it is hanging at the moment. But again, that's fine. I was going to trade it anyway. The problem that black has kind of created for himself is that he's lost a tempo here with knight g4 because I was ultimately going to be playing f3 to support g4 anyway, and also f3 supports the e4 square. That's just a standard move in the 150 attack that I just haven't played yet. So after we trade these bishops, I just play f3, which is a move I wanted to play anyway, and now I get to play it with tempo. So the knight has to go back, and he does go back to f6. And now black has essentially wasted two moves in an already very dynamic attacking position for white. So at this point in the game, I knew that I had an advantage here. I didn't know how much of an advantage. According to the engine, I'm plus 1.9, so almost plus 2 here. But you have to play it precisely. And of course, I didn't find all the right moves. But I found enough good moves here that I don't believe I ever let the advantage slip until the very end, where I allowed my opponent a drawing chance that he didn't find. So let's see how the game continues. So I've got to kind of continue with my plan here. The engine wants to actually just go ahead and play d5 here. So just kind of grabbing more space with tempo, which makes sense. It's often in this line hard to know when to play d5, and if black ends up playing either e5 or c5, it's hard to know whether to play d5 or to capture. But in any case, I played g4, so just continuing with my plan, and this is not really that much worse than d5 according to the engine. I'm still doing fine. So black does continue with e5. And then this is kind of what I was just saying. It's hard to know whether to capture this, to push this, to play knight e2 and just leave the tension. In this case, the engine wants to play knight e2 and just defend the pawn and leave this tension here in the center. I ended up pushing, which again is not a bad move, but it does take my advantage down to about +1. Interestingly though, the only way that black is able to keep it at that +1 level, he's got to play the move knight d4, which is not a very natural move to play, because you're just kind of sitting here in the midst of white structure, and whenever you go forward like this with a knight, you worry about it getting trapped, because the pawn that just chased you is taking away the squares behind you that you would, I was going to mark that red, that you would retreat to. So it's a difficult move to play visually. If you calculate it a bit, it does make sense. And part of the point, I think, is that if black does play knight d4 and white plays knight e2, black will just take it, rather than allowing white to capture, because if you allow white to capture, and then you have to take back with the pawn, you're going to end up losing that pawn. So I think that was the idea there. In any case, my opponent didn't play that move, which, again, I feel is a hard move to play over the board. Instead, he played knight e7, and now I'm back to having a bit bigger of an advantage. I'm just ahead of +1 now. I'm at +1.3. And I'm not going to give updates on the eval every move here, but just kind of giving you the idea that this hasn't been perfect, but I'm still doing pretty well. So, continuing on, I go ahead with h4. So again, this is just continuing my plan of going after the king. I really want to be able to play h5 next, and my opponent knows that I really want to play h5, and so he plays h5 himself to stop that from happening. And now it's, again, at a point where it's difficult to find the right move. I did actually play the correct move here, but as it happened in the game, I was not very confident that this was the right plan. The right move is g5, and this is what I ended up doing. But it's hard to play because you are closing off this structure. These pawns can't get traded off anymore. So here, it really is tempting to capture here instead and just try to open up a file. And now you think, well, okay, maybe I'll get my knight out of the way, I'll bring my rook onto the same file as the king, and try to create something. And honestly, maybe that would work. It's not the best plan, but it still, the engine still likes white better there. G5 is a little bit more precise, though, and I've got the squares highlighted, so I'll get rid of that. The reason that G5 actually does make sense here is that there still is another way to break in the position. You still have the f-pawn. So even though you're locking up the G and H pawns, you're still going to be able to advance the f-pawn and still be able to break open the king side a bit. And the other nice thing is that, again, we are chasing the knight, so the knight has to retreat, and my opponent actually did play the best move according to the computer, knight e8. It maybe seemed more natural to play knight d7, but I think it just doesn't want to block in the light squared bishop here, which kind of makes sense. So now knight ge2, and the idea is I'm just supporting an f4 break. c6, so counter-attacking in the center, and I decided to just go ahead with f4 anyway. And so now there's multiple exchanges of pawns in the center that are about to happen, and there's a lot to calculate in this position. I'm not going to dive into every sideline here. I'm just going to kind of show what happened, but if you want to kind of pause and look at it, it is a big calculation that you have to kind of do here to try to find the right moves for either side. In this position, the engine does want black to capture on d5 right away. My opponent did not, though. He played bishop g4, which actually is kind of an annoying move, and I think this was part of the reason that he played knight to e8 instead of d7, is that he wanted this bishop to still be able to get out here. And it's a bit annoying because it does pin the knight to my rook, so for the moment this knight can't move. And I didn't quite find the best move here, but I found the right idea. The best move is actually to play bishop h3 and kind of force this dark squared bishop to trade itself either for the bishop or for the knight right away. I did play that, but I inserted this capture first. So f takes e5, my opponent takes back right away, and again, the engine says black should take here instead. Hard to make all of the right decisions with that many possible captures. So he takes back with the e-pawn, and now I'm looking at this and I'm thinking, maybe there's something with this d-pawn. And I remember spending a lot of time calculating this, that my plan was always to play bishop h3 here, but I'm thinking, is there something to trying to force this through? Because right now it's safe on d6, and I spent a lot of time looking at that. And ultimately I just decided that no, after this knight moves, it's probably just going to go to c8, and then suddenly I'm attacked 3 times, and I don't have the tactics to bail me out here. So instead, bishop h3, which is still solid. Funny enough, the engine really does want to play d6. I don't really understand how it all works, but the computer, it's funny that I spent a lot of time looking at it, and the computer actually says I was right to look at it, but I didn't end up playing it. I played bishop h3 instead. And so now the dark squared bishop is forced to trade itself off. My opponent chose to take on h3 rather than taking the knight. So I take back with the rook, of course. And now queen d7 is played, so attacking the rook over here. Got to move it to safety, and then this was kind of a nice idea of rook d3 here. So now I'm really putting everything behind this d-pawn. And I very well could still try advancing it. I also might just capture on c6 and try to dominate this d-file and try to create something there. I do still have an edge in the position here. I'm just over +1, but material's still equal, so it's really hard to prove the advantage still. I'm still just kind of grinding it out and just trying to find good moves. So black goes ahead and captures, which I think he pretty much had to do. It was going to have to happen at some point, because, like I was saying, there's too much behind the idea of either pushing or capturing here. And at some point, black was going to have to take this, and he chose this moment. And now, even though taking with the pawn would give me a dangerous-looking passer here, because I've got all of my heavy hitters stacked on the d-file, I actually want to keep that file open. So don't want to put any pawns on that file and close it off, so instead I take with the knight. And black trades knights, and I take back with the rook, of course. Again, not wanting to put a pawn on that file. The queen moves to safety to the e6 square, and now queen c3. And so finally, I might actually be looking at winning a pawn here. It's difficult to try to defend that, and black actually didn't attempt to defend it. Really, the only move that you could try is f6 here, and ultimately then you're having to try to defend it with your king, and that doesn't work, because after pawn takes, taking with the rook or the knight won't defend, and so you have to take back with the king, and then just the rook slides over to f1, and so you're going to be losing this pawn anyway. So black played rook c8, which forces me to take with the queen instead of the rook. It's possible that rook takes could work because I am hitting the queen, but I liked queen takes just fine. Just force the queen trade now that I'm winning a pawn. And so we trade the queens off. And now we've kind of reached nearly the end game here. You could call this the end game or the late middle game. The queens are off the board now. And now it's a matter of figuring out how to win. I do have an extra pawn, but I don't have a passed pawn yet. My one extra pawn is really this d-pawn that is isolated and potentially vulnerable if black can get his pieces active. So it's not easy. I kind of have to still do a lot of work to win this. So black goes ahead and plays f6, so trying to free up the knight and the rook, basically. Black would very much like for me to capture this so that one of his pieces can come off the back rank to recapture. So rook e7. I'm not going to let the knight and rook free themselves quite that easily. Black blocks on f7, which was pretty much the only choice. He could play king g8 as well, but he went with rook f7. And now rook d to d7. So the idea here is I don't want to give up control of this 7th rank. So if I capture this and capture, king captures back, I mean, ultimately I can still just play the rook down, but it does let the king get out of here and sort of break containment. So I just bring the other rook in so that if black chooses to trade rooks, which now he has to do because otherwise I'll win a rook, then I still get to keep my rook on the 7th rank. So this is the position we reach. And now the king does have to move to the back rank, so he does. And here, rather than just taking b7 right away, I found the best move here, which is g takes f6 first. So the pawn temporarily defends the rook, and the point is that if I were to take right away, and I'll show this as a sideline here, the issue is that now this capture can happen, and black does have a rather dangerous passed pawn that I have to deal with. So it's not like I'm losing now, I'm still ahead, but this is now significantly more difficult because of the outside pass pawn. In the actual game line, taking first, knight takes, and then rook takes b7. Now, black still has to work to create that pass pawn out there. It could still happen if black manages to achieve g5, but he's not ready to play that just yet, so this was kind of the idea. In all of this as well, the d-pawn does ultimately get traded for the b-pawn, because it is black's move here, so black can just capture, or excuse me, the e-pawn, not the d-pawn. Knight takes e4. And this is what happened. And in this position, okay, I could have just taken the a-pawn. This was perfectly fine to capture. I could have and should have. It is the best move. I was a bit worried about some potential counterplay happening if I take an extra move to grab that pawn. In reality, I was probably seeing ghosts here. I should mention this was round 3 in a 5-round tournament, so this is the Saturday night round. So I'd already played 2 long games of chess in this day, and this is the 3rd one. So at this point, I was kind of running on fumes a bit. So instead, I decided to play knight f4, so get the knight active, and then also just hit this pawn that is loose at the moment here. And so black plays rook c6, which does defend the pawn. It also creates an annoying threat, though, which is that rook f6 now would pin the knight to mate because the black knight is covering the d2 square. So I do actually have to deal with that threat, and I do. I play b3, so give my king an escape so that if rook f6 happens, my knight can just move. And indeed, rook f6 does happen here, and the knight moves. Rook f1 check, king b2, rook h1. So going after this h4 pawn. But I have a nice move here that defends that pawn, and that is just to bring the knight back to f4. And the point is that the pawn is defended indirectly by a fork. So the rook can't capture it, and if the rook moves back to f1 to chase the knight, I'll be able to just take the g6 pawn. So black could play rook g1 here and try to defend the pawn. Instead, though, my opponent chose to play g5. So after g5, I did miss a move here. I could have... So what I ended up doing, I ended up just capturing the pawn. There was a slightly better move, though, which was knight e6. So the point being, it is another knight fork, so check the king, and then we're going to capture the pawn with the knight. Or you could even capture with the pawn at that point and leave the knight on e6 if you wanted to. So I actually do end up winning that pawn that way. Although the h-pawn probably is lost after that. It's hard to see everything, but it does actually make sense that move is more precise. I ended up just taking the pawn, though. Knight takes, and then rook to b5. So, again, I'm kind of foregoing capturing this pawn. My logic is that I'll have time to win this later, and ultimately I was correct. The idea is just that I would much rather go get this pawn because it's the dangerous pawn that black still has. And rook b5 actually was the correct move according to the computer as well. So now knight f3. I go ahead and take, and I could have taken with either the knight or the rook. Okay, so knight d5, and now, ultimately, well, I've got to save my rook, so rook d5. And now I've got to figure out, okay, I've got these two extra pawns. I've got 3 on 1, and my c-pawn is passed, but my opponent still has a knight and rook on the board, so how do I manage to actually advance these pawns and promote one of them? So, it is tricky, but I played it mostly pretty well here. So first, just going to get my knight back into the game here, and getting it off of that h5 square means the rook can now move off of the 5th rank. Okay, black is going to get the king closer. I'm going to continue just rotating the knight, and just kind of putting it on an active square. And now here, okay, black came up and attacked my rook. I move over to the g file. All fairly sensible moves, I think. Now rook h2. So, pins the c-pawn to the king for the moment. That's okay. a3. So, the idea being just supporting the b4 square, just starting to get these pawns moving. Ultimately, what I would like to do is I would like to be able to play b4, get the king up to the b3 square, and then advance the c-pawn. Because ultimately, the c-pawn is the passed pawn here. That's the one that needs to move. But I can't move it right now because it's pinned, and if I just try getting the king out of the way and pushing it first, then I'm going to end up exposing my king to rook checks. So that was the idea of a3 there. So now knight d4, so this threatens to just capture this pawn right away. And knight b4, defending it. And yeah, a5 might look like the tempting move. Not possible, though. The rook covers that square. So king f6, and then, again, because I don't want to allow a5, I've got to stay on the 5th rank, and rook a5 is actually the most natural place to go, and the best move. Because, again, if I can just capture this pawn, then I've got 3 passed pawns, and it's going to be a lot easier. So black goes back to defend it, and now my c-pawn is actually unpinned, which is nice. So king c3, the idea being I don't want to just push the c-pawn right away and let the rook just come right back down with check. It probably wouldn't be the worst thing if that happened, but nonetheless, I want to be patient with this. So king c3, knight e2, king d2, and when you're kind of this fight between the king and knight, the important thing to remember, and really any time you're calculating anything with knight moves, the knight always moves to the opposite color that it's on. So that means that if the knight and king are both on a dark square, and okay, this isn't the best example, but in this position, when they're both on a dark square, the knight can move with check, potentially. So knight e2 was in play, but now, after king d2, the king is on a dark square, the knight is on a light square, the knight cannot move with check. So, the other pattern to know is that if they're on the same diagonal with one square in between, there's no check. This is the itch that the knight cannot scratch. So, anyway, useful to know for these endgames with kings and knights. So the knight goes back to d4, and now king d3. So again, staying on the opposite color of the knight, the knight can't move with check, and it's got to move. So knight f3, and now knight c6. And so the knight this whole time, the other part of this that I didn't mention, and I can go back and show it, since this rook retreated to defend the pawn, this knight is covering the c6 square right now and preventing the white knight from going there. So part of the purpose of this sort of dance with the king and knight was to get the knight to move off of the defensive c6, and now indeed I do play knight c6 here. So it was mostly about getting the the king out in front of the pawns to be able to help them advance, but it was also about being able to play knight c6 and just put the maximum amount of pressure on that a7 pawn. So now we get knight e1 check, king d2, and again I could, well in this case I can't go to a light square safely because the c-pawn would hang if I do. So king d2, knight back to f3, and now king c1. And so staying on opposite colors, the knight can't check me, and now black is kind of out of resources on being able to defend this pawn. So rook c7, and here, interestingly, the best move is not to capture the pawn, and I actually reasoned that out in the game, and I played the correct move here. Instead of capturing the pawn, I played rook a6. So again, the idea is patience. You're still fine if you capture it. If you play knight takes, this is still okay. The problem is just that now your knight is a little bit out of bounds, and black gets some annoying counterplay by going after the c2 pawn. It's not anything that you can't deal with, but rook a6 is the more patient move, and it actually is the best move here. So black moves the king out of the path of discovered checks, and now b4. And the idea with b4 is just, I don't want to capture this with the knight, I want to capture with the rook. So I'm just going to bring this pawn all the way up to b5, defend the knight, and then play rook takes a7. So king e4, indeed I do play b5, king to d5, and rook takes a7. And now the interesting thing here is that the rook trade is basically forced at this point. The problem is that because of where black placed his king, the only place the rook can go that is not on this 7th rank is the c8 square, and there's a knight fork if he goes there. So the only option is to take the rook, so rook takes a7, knight takes a7, and now king to c5. And then here, I've finally reached a position where I should be able to just kind of relax and just win this endgame with 3 extra pawns. And here I made some mistakes. So the first mistake is that I didn't realize that the threat in this position is for black to play king b6 here, and that effectively forks the knight and pawn. So what I need to do here is just play a4 and defend the pawn. Instead I played king b2, which is still okay. But after this fork, this is where I actually let my opponent back into the game. So again here, the correct move is a4. And basically you're just going to give up the knight, and these 3 pawns are going to be able to beat black's knight. You're going to be able to force one through and promote it easily enough. And I actually did have that idea correct. I decided ultimately this pawn is more valuable than the knight. I'll let the knight go and I'll just defend my pawn on b5. The problem is, instead of a4, I chose c4, and here black actually does have a way out of this now. This is a draw if black plays it correctly, and it kind of blew my mind when I realized this getting ready to make this video. The plan here that works now is to play, and I'm going to enter it in as a sideline here, the move knight e5. So ignore the knight on a7, don't capture it. And the reason that c4 doesn't work but a4 does is that after knight e5, this pawn is attacked. And the problem is, if I try to advance and defend it, black can still win it. And the knight against 2 pawns, the A and B pawn and a knight, black has enough to be able to hold this ending incredibly. I played around with this a little bit. I just played it out against an engine. You can do the same if you want. But yeah, it is pretty incredible. Black has just enough resources here to hold off white's 2 pawns. So, my opponent, however, did not see that, thankfully for me. And that's a very difficult move to find. When there's a hanging piece like that, you just want to take the piece, and that's what he did. And now I am back to winning again. So, the rest of this is actually pretty easy to do. These 3 pawns are going to just kind of roll together here. King c3, king b6, king b4. So the king and all the pawns are now connected together, and it's impossible for the knight to actually successfully stop all 3. Ultimately, the knight is eventually going to be forced to give itself up for 1 or 2 pawns, and then the last one will still be able to promote. And we'll just kind of see how they advance together and how this played out. So, knight e4, c5 check, king back to b7, king c3, the problem is the knight is taking away this square from the king, which is a bit annoying. So, king c3 just going around, king a7, a4, again, wanting to keep the pawns together. Knight d7, c6, knight b6, attacking the a4 pawn, but it's easy enough to defend. Just king b4, and actually you could even just play a5 instead, but king b4 works just as well. Knight to c5 check, king c5, knight back, and now a5, and this was kind of my plan. And then we just push through. And then, yeah, at this point, with the knight being on the c8 square, b7 forces a promotion, because there's 2 promotion threats to either push to b8 or capture the knight, and black can't, of course, stop both. The geometry of how the knight moves means that it can't move off of c8 and cover the b8 square at the same time. My opponent had an interesting option here that I probably would have tried in his position, which I would have played king a7. The reason being that taking the knight and promoting to a queen, that's a stalemate. All of these squares are covered. The queen covers these, the pawn and the king cover this one. That's a stalemate. So the solution there is actually to promote to a rook. And then there's only one legal move for black, which is to come back, and then it's mate.
Der checkmate, furchtbar, schrecklich.
Okay. Fritz is speaking in other languages. But my opponent didn't actually play king a7. Instead, he just played knight e7, which, again, it's still going to be mate in 2 here. I just promote to a queen, and then there's no way to stop all the checkmate threats. If you go back to c8, there's several different mate in 2s here, so just pick your favorite. I think I probably would have just chosen queen b5 and queen b7.
Checkmate.
Now he's back to speaking English. But there's a million different mate in 2s in that position. So, yeah, that was how the game actually ended, though, with queen b6. So, yeah, it was a game ultimately that I was rather proud of, and that's why I wanted to share it. Proud of in the sense that I got kind of that early advantage, and the old saying is that one of the hardest things to do in chess is to win a 1 position, and in this case, I managed to actually do it, and I played it almost almost perfectly. Not perfectly according to the engine, but I never gave up that advantage until that one move in the endgame where I allowed a draw. But still, I'll take credit for the win. It was a very difficult draw to see there. So that was that game. That was the best game that I played in that tournament, where I finally cracked 1700 for the first time. So thank you for watching One Brain Ops, and I will see you next time.